Hello and welcome back to the TikATeeMethod for the final week of Rhythmic Sight Reading, the TikATeeMethod, Book 1, Week 36. And yes, that implies Book 2 is on its way, so stay tuned. For this video for Week 36, I'm going to demystify swing eighth notes. How in the world do they work? What's the math behind swing eighth notes? Is it a tangible thing? Is it an intangible thing? Is it a precision thing? Well, it's a little bit of all of that, and we're going to dive into swing eighth notes. I'm also going to talk to you about how to transfer the Tik-A-Tee verbiage into swing so that it makes sense. I'm going to give you a few pointers on how to perform swing so that it's stylistically accurate as well. So we're going to dive into all those concepts in this video. We're going to do a couple of exercises together. I hope you'll stick with me for the whole video because we're going to swing. Let's go make it happen. Okay, here we are on the first page of week 36. And let me start off by saying this. This video is intended for beginning to intermediate musicians who are just starting out on their journey learning about swing eighth notes and a simple time signature. I'm going to be discussing the fundamentals behind swing eighth notes, the math behind swing eighth notes. I'm also going to be offering up some articulation suggestions again so that you perform swing stylistically accurately. For the more advanced jazz musicians out there, I'm not going to be getting into some of the more advanced concepts like, for example, up-tempo charts. What happens to swing eighth notes when the tempo is really, really fast in a bebop chart, for example? I'm not going to be getting into that. In today's video, all of our examples and exercises will be slow to medium tempos so that we can apply the correct math to the swing eighth notes as well as practice applying those articulations to help us swing those eighth notes properly. Let's start off by reading the paragraph at the top of the page together. Swing eighth notes are derived from a triplet subdivision. So that implies that swing eighth notes are actually a borrowed division from compound to simple. We'll talk about that in a minute. Although notated as eighth notes that appear normally in a simple time signature, such as common time, they are actually performed with a triplet feel. For our purposes here, only the eighth notes will swing. In Book 2, for example, I've got an entire week dedicated to swing 16th notes. But for week 36, only the eighth notes will swing. All other notes will remain as normal in simple time. The TikATeeMethod verbiage also stays the same. That translation, that transfer of the verbiage is very logical so that we don't have to break our brains trying to think in swing with different words. The illustrations below demonstrate how swing charts are notated in contrast to how they should be performed. And here's a little side note. Notice the music font change. The font used here is a jazz music font often used by music publishers. So I hope this all makes sense. Let's dive in a little bit deeper. And one really cool thing here is highlighted in yellow. You can now go back to any simple time signature exercise in my entire book and just change the eighth notes to swing. So now, even though it appears that only week 36 and bonus week C have swing exercises, in actuality, you can take any 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, or even 5/4 measure, so forth and so on, any simple time signature exercise in the book, turn the eighth notes into swing, and now you have a swing exercise. So go back and try those when you have some time and want to really challenge yourself. All right, let's get into the math and the concept of borrowed division that is fundamental to performing swing eighth notes accurately. Let's first look at this example right here. It's a common time measure, a measure in 4/4, filled with 8 eighth notes. It would normally sound like this. T, 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 T. But in big band charts, in jazz band charts, in swing charts, or even in some orchestral charts, you may see something like this, where it says the word swing, and then next to it, it will say 2 eighth notes is equivalent to a quarter note to an eighth note triplet subdivision. When you see that in your music, even though eighth notes are notated by the publisher, all of the eighth notes are supposed to be swung. And that's a really important concept. And here's where the borrowed division concept comes into play. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's look at this middle example right here. This is how the example on the left, this one right here, is supposed to be performed. Even though it's notated as just regular old eighth notes in simple time, the way that we perform swing eighth notes is just like this example in the middle. And you can see right away that borrowed division because you can see a triplet breakdown. So swing eighth notes actually sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Trillet, 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 trillet. Versus T, 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 which is how that notation on the left is. But as soon as it says that the eighth notes are swing, and it gives us some sort of indication that the music is swing, we need to now perform it trillet, 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 trillet. I hope that makes sense, starting to make sense anyway. Now, how does the Tik-A-Tee verbiage translate? Do we say trillet if we see triplets? No, because they're eighth notes, we still just keep it on T. So we would actually perform this exercise like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. T, 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 T. You hear how those eighth notes are still T? What I'll do is one measure of straight, even eighth notes followed by one measure of swing eighth notes using the Tik-A-Tee verbiage and applying the appropriate style change. 1, 2, 3, 4. T, 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 T. So you can hear that difference between the even or straight eighth notes and the swing eighth notes. That middle example here is how those swing eighth notes are actually conceptualized in our brain, even though we're not really going to say trillet as part of a triplet subdivision. Now, taking this one step further, we know that triplets are a borrowed division from a compound time signature into a simple time signature. Well, let's look at this example on the right-hand side here. This is in 12/8. So this is the time signature, this compound time signature, that we're actually borrowing from to get our swing eighth note. So instead of triplets, now we just have a quarter note to an eighth note on each of the 4 beats in 12/8. And we know that in 12/8 that the dotted quarter note's getting the beat, and there's going to be 4 dotted quarter notes in each of those measures. Each one of those dotted quarter notes can be broken down into 3 equal eighth notes. But in this case, we have a quarter note and an eighth note. So if I was to just put a little bar here between each of the beats, you can see beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, and beat 4. Now, what would that sound like? Here it is. 2, 3, 4. Ta, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti. And guess what? That's swing. Ta, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti. So that example all the way on the left, this one right here, can actually be performed either thinking about triplets, trillet, 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 or 12/8. Ta, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti. Both of those are equivalent. They're the same exact rhythm. And that is how swing eighth notes are supposed to be performed and thought of mathematically. There are 2 common mistakes that beginning musicians make when they're first learning how to perform swing. The first one has to do with articulation, and I'll get into some more articulation suggestions in a few minutes, but this one is what I call the chop. And I hear this most commonly in younger musicians that are trying to swing. Instead of T, 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 you can hear how that's legato. There's a little bit of an accent on that the second eighth note in the swing, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But a lot of beginning musicians, especially like middle school age students, will go T, 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 T when they swing. And that's what I call the chop. T, 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 T. Now, that, even though rhythmically accurate to a degree, doesn't swing because of the articulation. The second most common mistake I hear is an actual rhythm problem. And as you can see in this middle box here with that big red X, you can see that this is an incorrect subdivision. So if we think about the subdivisions correctly in swing, triplet, triplet, trillet, trillet, T, 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 right? That's the correct subdivision. But if you're you're not subdividing correctly and you're subdividing into 16th notes, ticka 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 tee yati 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 tee yati 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 yati. That's not swinging. That's a dotted 8th note to a 16th note. And again, this is what I hear most often in beginning musicians, usually middle school, elementary school especially, and beginning high school musicians that are just learning how to swing. You've got to get the rhythm correct. T, 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 triplet, triplet, get that triplet subdivision going. And you've got to have the articulation elongated, legato, full value, if you will, with a slight accent on the 2nd 8th note. T, 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 T. And again, I'll get into some of this stuff in a few minutes. Let's move on to the bottom half of this page and talk about a couple more examples. Example number 1 right down here is just an exercise in swing 8th notes. So that is the way it would be notated in your music if you were, for example, sitting in a jazz band. Example number 2 and example number 3 are the ways that number 1 should be performed mathematically and thinking about those rhythms. Number 2, using the borrowed division of triplets to perform the rhythms in number 1 correctly. And number 3, just going straight to the source of 12/8, that compound time signature, and using the rhythms in 12/8 to accurately perform the rhythms in number 1. So I hope that all makes sense. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to perform number 2 first so you can hear it with triplets. Then I'll perform number 3, that one in 12/8, so you can hear what that one sounds like. Then, using the correct translation of the Tik-A-Tee verbiage to vocalize the rhythms in number 1, I will perform number 1 using the words we're actually going to use in all of the exercises for week 36. I hope that makes sense. Let's dive into number 2 first. A 1, 2, 3, 4, ta, trillet, trillet, let, ta, trillet, ta. Let trillet, ta, ta, triplet, triplet, ta, trillet. Now, even though those rhythms were performed accurately in number 2 using triplets and correlate directly to the rhythms in example number 1, exercise number 1 right above it, we would never use that verbiage to perform number 1. The whole premise of the Tik-A-Tee method is that the verbiage cannot become confusing and a tongue twister. And let me tell you, that was not easy to do. But when you use just TT as the swing 8th notes in number 1, which I'll do in a minute, it's going to make a whole lot of sense. So why am I performing number 2 and even number 3 for you? It's to show you where the swing rhythm is actually derived from and how we need to conceptualize it mathematically, rhythmically in the exercise when we perform number 1. All right, so now I'm going to perform number 3 in 12/8. You'll notice the removal of the words triplet because I'm in the origin of that borrowed division, a compound time signature, which is 12/8. 4 beats in the measure, the dotted quarter note gets the beat. Here is what number 3 sounds like. A 1, 2, 3, 4, ta, ta, ti, ta, ta, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ta. Ti ta ti ta ti ti ta ti ta ta ti 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 ta ti ta ti 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 ta ti ta ta ti. So if you go back and you listen to the performance of example number 2 and the performance of example number 3, while looking at the music for example number 1, you'll begin to understand, you'll begin to comprehend that the rhythms in number 1, that swing jazz exercise there, that is how they're performed. That is how they're supposed to sound. Now, we are going to make it a lot easier here because we're just going to use TT for those swing 8th notes. So we don't have to worry about triplets. We don't have to worry about tas and ts being combined as it was in exercise number 3 in that compound time signature. So now let me perform number 1 for you in the way that we are going to use the Tik-A-Tee verbiage to swing. A 1, 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta ti ti ta ti 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 ta ti ta ti 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 ta T T T T ta, T T T ta ta, triplet T T T T triplet T T ta, T T. So hopefully you can hear how much easier it is to swing those eighth notes using TT as opposed to triplet or the ta-T in the compound time signature. By just using TT and making sure that we're understanding the rhythm behind those swing eighth notes, whether we're thinking about that borrowed division of triplets or we're thinking in that compound time signature, to make sure that our swing rhythm is accurate mathematically, then we should be okay. And it's actually a lot of fun to perform it this way, and you don't have to change the Tik-A-Tee verbiage. Eighth notes are still T, just the way we perform the eighth notes, in this case swing, is different. I hope that makes sense. Now it is time, my friends. Let's go find a couple of exercises and put this into some more practice. All right, the two exercises we're going to do today are 36A and 36B at the bottom of this page. But please know there are many more swing exercises in week 36. There's also a bonus week, week C, that is dedicated to swing exercises. And don't forget what I said earlier. You can take any simple time signature exercise in the book and just turn the eighth notes into swing eighth notes, and then you've got a plethora of swing exercises at your disposal. Now, before we get into exercise 36A, the first one for this video, let's talk about the suggestions in this box first. Number 1 says, replace all marcato accented quarter notes with dot, D-A-H-T, instead of ta. Now, this is only a suggestion. Like I said, the premise of the Tik-A-Tee verbiage is to not confuse you. But when it comes to jazz, I often do this with my big band, with my students in my jazz band. I will tell them that whenever you see a caret accent, that marcato accent over a quarter note, it needs to be a little bit more punchy than perhaps a concert band, a wind ensemble, or an orchestra. So I asked my jazz band students to articulate that and vocalize that as dot. Now, you don't have to do this. I will do it in the exercises today. You can just keep the quarter notes as ta to make your life easier. But if you want to have a little bit more stylistic accuracy, you can change marcato quarter notes to dot. And number 2, I've already talked about a little bit. Be sure to subdivide triplets when you swing your eighth notes and keep them connected and smooth, legato, elongated, not separated or what I call choppy. So in that example up there, trillet, 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 T, 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 T. Do not perform T, 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 T. That's the chop. So let's hear it again correctly. T, 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 T. Keep it legato. Now, number 3 is a suggestion for beginning musicians or intermediate musicians that are just starting to learn swing. As I said, I'm not going to get into more advanced swing concepts in this video, but this one often helps students understand the idea of where the accent should be when you swing eighth notes. And it should be on the second eighth note in the grouping. So a light accent on the upbeat or second eighth note in swing helps out a lot. So instead of T, 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 which is all pretty straight and narrow, if you put a little accent on the second eighth note in the grouping, it helps swing a little bit more. T, 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 T. I hope that you'll be able to do that in these exercises. It will help you swing. And once you get the concept of swing eighth notes and you've got your metronome clicking on all 4 beats, I strongly suggest that you change your metronome to only click on beats 2 and 4. This will represent the hi-hat of the drummer's drum set as they're performing their swing style groove for you. So you have that 1, 2, 3, 4, T, 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 T. You can hear how that really helps you swing. And again, by clicking only on 2 and 4, the important beats in swing, it will help you swing a little bit harder and replicate that drummer's hi-hat. And the next one, number 5, is often one that kind of trips up beginning musicians when they're just learning swing. As long as they've got eighth notes in a row, T, 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 they're fine. But as soon as we add some rests in there, students will stop thinking in swing. And my suggestion in number 5 is to be sure to count your rests in swing too. always subdivide in triplets. So in that example right here, this one where you have the 8th rest and the 8th note, you shouldn't be thinking one and, that's straight or even 8th notes. You should be thinking triplet, triplet, triplet. That's where that proper location of that second one comes in. So you have that jet da 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 da, putting that 8th note in the correct place by counting the rests in swing. So let's say you have an entire measure of rests in swing. You should be thinking that whole time, T, 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 T1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, as opposed to 1, 2, 3, 4. The more we can get students thinking in swing, both through the actual notes they're playing, as well as, and perhaps more importantly, as the rests, then we can start to really feel our music swinging even in the silence. And the last one, number 6, is very straightforward. And actually, in exercises 36A and 36B, we don't even have 16th notes, so we don't really have to worry about it or be concerned about it. As I said in book 2, I'll be talking about swing 16th notes. But all of the exercises in week 36, any of the exercises that have 16th notes, they're only going to be straight or even 16th notes. Tik-A, 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 Tik-A. So even though the 8th notes may swing, T, 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 Tik-A, 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 the 16th notes will remain even throughout. So I hope those suggestions in the box at the top of the page are helpful. Let's now get into a quick analysis of 36A so we can swing it. All right, here we are at exercise 36A. Now, the first thing I want to do so that we can really differentiate and understand the difference between straight and even 8th notes and swing 8th notes is, before we even analyze this exercise quickly and perform it with swing 8th notes, I'm going to perform it for you here with straight 8th notes and ignoring all of the articulations. Those articulations are intended to help the exercise swing harder, so I'm going to ignore them. Here is 36A without swing. 1, 2, 3, 4, ta, ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, 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 ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, 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 ta. So understanding the difference between those even 8th notes and those swing 8th notes is really going to help us solidify this rhythmic concept. Now, quickly analyzing exercise 36A before we perform it in swing, I just want to analyze two things. Number one, I want to notice or locate all of the swing 8th notes first. So where are all the 8th notes that are going to swing? Followed by, where are all of my marcato quarter notes? Because I'm going to change that verbiage from ta to D-A-H-T, that dot idea, when I perform it. And again, you're welcome to just stay on ta, make your life easier, or you can change it to dot and see if that helps you really, really emphasize the style here. So our swing 8th notes for this one, we've got some 8th notes right here. These 8th notes will swing. 8th notes, 8th notes. This is really important right here because this last 8th note is actually going to be the last triplet of beat 4, right? Triplet, triplet, ta, ti, ta, ti, da, 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 dum. So understanding the placement of that is really important. Remember, during long notes, during rests, if we're counting and thinking in swing, we are going to perform swing accurately. We also have some swing 8th notes here. We have them here, we have a couple here, and we have 4 right here. So there's a lot of locations where we're going to have swing 8th notes. And you'll notice I put an accent on the second 8th notes in the groupings of 2 so that we remember to slightly accent that second 8th note. That is going to help us perform this stylistically accurately, okay? Now, let's find all of our dot quarter notes here. I'll do that in red. So we've got one right here, one right here, one right here. We've got a whole bunch in this exercise, don't we? So that we can really, really practice those dots happening, okay? Now, regular accents on a long note, you just strike it just a little bit harder, not a big deal. So all of those ones that have red circles around them, those marcato quarter notes, I'm going to use D-A-H-T as my vocalized verbiage, if you will. All right, let's swing now. Let's perform exercise 36A, and I'm just going to use my snapping of a finger, so that'll be my metronome, if you will, and we're just going to perform this one together. So I hope that you'll join me. Let's go. All right, the first thing I want to do is erase all of this ink so we can see the exercise more clearly. I'm going to give us all 4 beats in my snapping here as opposed to the suggestion of just 2 and 4. Maybe we'll do that with exercise 36B. I'm also going to be singing this on an F. La la la, so I hope that you'll join me on that note or any note of your choosing. Here we go. A 1, 2, a 1, 2, swing, go, dot, T, 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 dot. Ta, T, 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 dot, T, T, dot, T, T, dot, ta, T, 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 ta, T, 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 dot, dot, T, T, dot, T, 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 ta. Yeah, and that is actually a lot of fun. Performing swing is always fun. You can hear I was swinging those eighth notes. I had that accent slightly on the second eighth note in each grouping. I had the dot, D-A-H-T marcato quarter notes. And during those 2 dotted quarter note eighth note rhythms, I was thinking in swing. Ta, T, triplet, triplet. Ta, T. We've always got to be thinking in swing during long notes and during rest. So there was a great opportunity to swing in this exercise. Now, you know the next step. We have no idea if we actually performed that correctly, do we? But thankfully, there are MP3s on my website with the quote-unquote answers to every exercise in my book. So let's go to my website right now, find the MP3 answer for exercise 36A, and go make sure that we did this correctly. All right, here we are at my website where you can find all 363 of the MP3 answers that accompany my book. Now, if you've been watching these videos, you know what your 3 options here are. You can first just listen to the exercise and check for your accuracy that way, or you can, option number 2, vocalize along with the MP3, or number 3, especially if your principal instrument is not the voice, break out your instrument and perform along with the MP3. Now, for these exercises in week 36, the count off is 1, 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4, and you'll notice that I've included a little drum set in here so that you can really feel that swing style. Okay, so without further ado, here is exercise 36A. One, 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. Dot, T, 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 dot, ta, T, 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 dot, T, T, dot, T, T, dot, ta, T, 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 ta, T, 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 dot, dot, T, T, dot, T, 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 ta. Yeah, there you have it. Nice and swinging. And when we did this a moment ago, when we performed it together, I was at a little bit faster of a clip. My tempo is a little bit faster. So that one is a little bit more accommodating to that 104 beats per minute on the metronome. So I hope that that helped. Let's move on to exercise 36B. One, 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, here we are at exercise 36B, and just like I did for 36A, I want us to really understand, to really comprehend the difference between straight or even eighth notes and swing eighth notes. So I'm going to perform exercise 36B as if there was no articulation and it was even eighth notes. Then we'll talk about the swing and we can hopefully really comprehend the difference afterwards. Here it is. 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Ta, T, 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 ta, ta. T, 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 ta, triplet, T, T, triplet, T, T, ta. T, 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 ta, T, ta. T, T, ta, T, 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 ta, T, ta. So there it is with straight or even eighth notes. Now, let's get into the analysis and see how this is going to swing when we change all those eighth notes to swinging eighth notes. Now, one thing you may have noticed when I perform this exercise with even eighth notes is that there's a lot of syncopation, a lot of entrances on upbeats in this particular exercise. And we've talked a lot about syncopation in the book up till this point. Well, we've already mentioned how important it is during long notes and during rests that we think in swing. When I performed this a moment ago, I was thinking in very even eighth notes during all the long notes and the rests so that my entrances were accurate. And that brings me to the third most common mistake that beginning musicians make when they're learning how to perform swing accurately. And that is inaccurate entrances. Understanding where a note actually comes in when it's an upbeat. And remember, in swing, if you've got an eighth rest followed by an eighth note, that eighth note is actually, conceptually, the third triplet in a triplet grouping. Triplet, triplet, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and T, 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 T. Those are all the third triplet on each of those beats, and that can be a very difficult concept for beginning musicians to grasp. So that's really important for us to understand that when we're counting during long notes or during rests, that we're always thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So I hope that helps. Let's get into a little bit of the analysis of this exercise now in swing. And in the analysis of this, let's really hone in on those upbeat, those syncopated entrances in swing. And let me say this before we even start. I mentioned earlier that swing is a tangible, mathematical, rhythmic concept that can be performed with precision and accuracy. However, and this is really important, there is a groove to swing. So even though there's a tangible aspect to swing, where you're thinking about the math and the compound borrowed division and all of that, there's also a groove and a feel that we can internalize as we're performing. And that's really important as opposed to always being so strict and thinking about the math behind it. If you can start to feel the swing groove, it starts to really make a lot of sense. So I hope that helps. Let's get into measure 1. I'm going to go one measure at a time for this one and really hone in on those syncopated entrances. In measure 1, it starts off with this dotted quarter note to eighth note rhythm, and that goes all the way back to a rhythm we learned in week 6, right? The dotted quarter note, eighth note. However, here in swing, we've got to think about this rhythm a little bit differently. So as we're performing that dotted quarter note, we've got to be subdividing triplets in our head. Triplet, 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 ta, ti, ta, ti, because that eighth note comes in a little bit later. Again, it's mathematical concept combined with, as I mentioned a moment ago, the feel, the internalization of the groove of swing, okay? In measure 2, we've got a marcato accent here. So we're going to say D-A-H-T, and you'll notice on beat 4 in measure 1, we've got a legato. So we're just going to say ta, but here with the marcato, we're actually going to use D-A-H-T for that. Then we've got an and of or an upbeat of beat 2 here with that eighth note. And again, triplets here is really important. Dot, triplet, dot, triplet, dot, T, 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 and so forth and so on. Coming in correctly, entering accurately is a really important skill to be learned when you're performing swing. The tendency for beginning or intermediate musicians learning swing is that they come in too soon. They enter too early because the even eighth notes will enter before that last triplet. I hope that makes sense. We've got another tenuto or legato quarter note here that will just be ta on beat 4. Measure 3, triplet T, T, triplet T, T. You've got triplets and you've got a couple of swing eighth notes in here, a really cool measure. In measure 4, D-A-H-T on beat 1, a rest on beat 2, then you've got the upbeat of beat 3. So again, that's going to be the third triplet of beat 3. Triplet, triplet. So 1 and 2 and 3, T, T, T. 1 and 2 and 3, T, T, T. And we can count that as much as we can feel that groove. All right, let's move on to measure 5. And in that first measure on that second line here, we have a rhythm that looks familiar to us. This is a rhythm we learned with even eighth notes way back in week 10. Ti-ta-ti. Ti-ta-ti. We have two notes that are syncopated, eighth note syncopation. Well, it's still syncopated in swing here. The only difference is we have to now be subdividing this rhythm internally into triplets. Ti-ta-ti. Ti-ta-ti. For example, this last eighth note right here will actually be the third eighth note triplet on beat 2. Now, going back to what I said earlier, do we really want to be mathematically thinking about this as we're performing? Of course not. It's a combination of understanding the groove of swing, that intangible, with the tangible of understanding that triplet subdivision and that borrowed division of swing eighth notes. So this rhythm sounds like this. Ti-ta-ti. Ti-ta-ti. Say that with me a couple times. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Ti-ta-ti. Ti-ta-ti. Okay, so that's that rhythm. It's very different than what it sounded like way back in week 10 when the eighth notes were even. So moving on, we have measure 6. We've got a little quarter rest here on beat 1, 2 swing eighth notes, a D-A-H-T on beat 3, dot marcato quarter note. Then we've got an entrance that is syncopated on the and of or the upbeat of beat 4. And we have to be thinking about that in swing. A 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. That's the correct entrance. A 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. T. We have to be thinking in triplets. And then we go through, we hold that through right here because there's a tie, so we don't re-articulate this eighth note right here. Then we've got another syncopated eighth note here on the and of or the upbeat of beat 3. So if I was just to perform beat 4 through this measure here, through measure 7, this is what it would sound like. A 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. T, 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 T. Okay? Very, very cool measure. Understanding those entrances and where to properly enter is super important. This eighth note right here on the and of 3 is actually the third triplet of beat 3. Triplet, triplet. Triplet, triplet, and starting to understand that is super, super helpful. And here we go again in measure 8 with the same measure that we had way back, or the same rhythm rather, that we had way back in measure 5. T, ta, ti. So if you look at measure 5 and you look at measure 8, they are the same. T, ta, ti, ta. Ti, ta, ti, ta. All right, so this is an exercise practicing syncopation, practicing entrances, accurate entrances in swing, and it will allow us to do two things. Number one, think tangibly. Think about the math of the rhythms and those subdivisions, as well as the intangible, internalizing the groove of swing and performing this exercise in such a manner that it doesn't become mathematically complicated, but instead, in lieu of, it feels like it's just swinging and grooving because we're feeling that groove. And using a metronome on only 2 and 4 for this exercise might help us. So let's perform it with me snapping only on beats 2 and 4. I think we can do it. Let's go. All right, and just like we did for exercise 36A, let's erase all of this ink so we can see the exercise more clearly. I'm only going to be snapping on 2 and 4 here, and I will be singing this again on an F. You're welcome to join me on this note, or whatever note you want to, la la la. But here's beats 2 and 4. Here we go. I'll give a 2-measure count off. A 1, 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4, ta, ti, 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 ta, dot, ti, 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 ta, triplet, ti, ti, triplet, ti, ti, dot, ti, 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 ta, ti, ta, ti, ti, dot, ti, 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 ta, ti, ta. All right. Yeah, you can feel that swing because as I'm snapping on 2 and 4, I'm thinking about the hi-hat and what the drummer will be playing with his left foot or her left foot, right? And then you're going to have the swing on the ride cymbal, okay? So thinking about that groove and what the drummer is doing, everybody working together, maybe thinking about a walking bass line, all of these things just help us grasp that intangible concept of swinging and making sure that we are swinging all those eighth notes. Okay, we don't know if we did it correctly. You know what we need to do. Let's go find the MP3 for exercise 36B right now. All right, here we are back at my website. I've got exercise 36B all queued up. You know what your 3 options are, so make a choice because without further ado, here we go. One, two, a 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ti, 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 ta, dot. T, 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 ta, triple a T, T, triple a T, T, dot. T, 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 ta, T, ta. T, T, dot. T, 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 ta, T, ta. Yeah, cool. There it is. A little bit different of a drum groove there. You'll notice the bass drum on beat 1. That really may not happen in real-world application of swing. I did that so that you could hear where the downbeat, the first beat of each measure was. Okay, you know the drill. If you have not yet chosen to play 36B on your instrument, you need to do that next before proceeding to the next concept or the next exercise. 1, 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that does it for week 36, the final week of book 1 of Rhythmic Sight Reading, the TikATeeMethod. So I'm already starting book 2. I can't wait to get it released. It'll be a little while. Stay tuned for more details on that. Thank you so much for joining me all the way to the end of this video today. I really hope by the end of this you were swinging and grooving and understanding this new rhythmic concept of swing eighth notes in a simple time signature. Remember, go out and get the book so that you can do more exercises. There are so many exercises now if you incorporate all of the simple time signature exercises in the book and just turn them into swing applications. So go out and get the book. It is available at my website, roncastinguay.com. It is also available on Amazon and jwpepper.com. And in the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, if you found this video helpful, please help out my small little channel here, the TikATeeMethod, by hitting that like and subscribe button and that notification bell so you get the latest video. Again, thank you so much for your support. I'm so proud and honored to be part of your rhythmic journey. I'll see you in the next video.